Hello, welcome to Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. Our focus is exam 70-515. This content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP.NET Videos.net. So video number 2 in our series, we're going to be talking about web forms, or web forms pages as Microsoft terms it on the certification site. Configuring and working with web forms and developing web forms are one of the core fundamental areas for the certification exam. You can see our earlier video series around Visual Studio 2008 with ASP.NET and C# to go over and firm up some of these fundamentals. But web forms execute on the server. The ASP.NET engine runs on web server and it executes the requests, and then it discards any information about that request when it sends down the response, so that makes it stateless. We'll talk about how you can emulate or keep state later on in the video series. If you've done any type of Windows development, you get many of the same rich benefits here with web forms. The ability to use controls, drag and drop, and basically have this logic encapsulated in a control. This is something else we'll be diving deeper into in various parts of the certification series. So it's Windows-like event-driven model is here. When we look at lifecycle events coming up soon in an upcoming video, you'll see how the various events that fire on the server happen. So again, see our earlier stuff to go deeper and deeper into these fundamentals. A couple things to keep in mind. We're talking about web application projects or websites, two different templates that both use web forms in .NET. Really not going to focus too much on this. One of the key differences is how things get compiled. The web app project, you get a single DLL, whereas the websites, you get have this in-place compilation model, allows you a little more flexibility. There are little pros and cons to both. Really doesn't matter so much for the certification exam. Just be aware they're there. We'll point out a few of the nuances as we go. You can also use IIS or Visual Studio Web Server to actually work with the web forms and work with your ASP.NET stuff. Actually, you actually do the deployment out in a production. You would deploy into the IIS world, but you do not have to have IIS locally to work and get the benefits of kind of doing the development. There are also a few gotchas here. One is if you're using the built-in web server, other people couldn't look and test your web app. So if you want to emulate or be more closely simulate production, you may want to use IIS. This is something else we won't focus much on. I will point out in the video a quick place where you can configure that. The main thing we want to touch on here is configuring web forms. There are a few different ways to do this. So one of the ideas is ASP.NET directives, which actually change how the compiler is going to behave and change the behavior of your application. We'll look at that. You're going to want to examine that in some detail. That'll be covered on the exam. One of the core files that's used for configuration with any of the ASP.NET stuff, including the web form stuff, is the web config file. So we'll point out what's going on with the web config file, and we'll show an example of how to do some configuration there. There are a couple other places you could look. So if you had a website, you'd have a slightly different experience, but you could use something called the ASP.NET configuration page to wire up some settings. If you have a web application project, you actually have a project file and you have a properties for that file, and there is a rich set of places there that you can do configuration. I'm just going to jump over and let's do the demo here. I'm going to do a file, new project. I'm in Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate. You could be in another edition of Visual Studio, that's fine. And I'm going to choose C#, and we have several different templates here available. I'm going to start with an ASP.NET empty web application, so it's just going to give us some bare bones artifacts. The other template, ASP.NET web application, gives us some starter pages and all of that. We want to keep this very simple to begin with to show you kind of the core things we're wanting to demonstrate here. Notice I just get a web config file at this point. I'm going to actually add a web form. I'm going to right-click the project and add a new item, and that's simply going to take me to a place where I could add a web form. Notice I could be using master pages here, classes, style sheets, etc. We'll be talking about all of that as we move throughout the series. Simply going to add a new web form here, and this is about as bare bones as it gets. And you notice that if we look at the source here, there's a couple things we want to point out right away. One is you notice this page directive up here. This is required for every web form that you'll be using in .NET. And directives in general, again, they affect the behavior of how your application is going to act. There's various settings here. So this is the page directive itself, and then you have a language property of that, auto event wire up, etc. One of the other core things you have to have for every web form is this form. It has to have the run at server attribute there, and all your controls will live there. So moving back up to the page directive, you notice that the language, the code behind, some basic stuff, this plumbing's pretty much handled for you by default. But if you need to change the behaviors for some of this, if I just hit the space bar, a lot of other type of settings here that are available. Event validation, session state, you can turn on and off. Now these all have default values, and if you don't see them listed up here, they're just set at their defaults. One of the common things is if I was wanting some more data around maybe how the web form is behaving, I could turn tracing on for this page. So I'll just simply put trace equals true here. It's false by default, so we need to add it in and toggle it to true. And if we just ran this web form now, it's going to expect just getting a blank web form back because we have no controls. You actually see all of this various trace data. So all the various events that have happened, the session state variables, if you had any cookies in play, the control tree, timings around the events, etc. So that's one example of turning something on here for the page directive. I'll set that back to false and rerun, and then you should see nothing now. So if you have one of these elements that are not listed, it's just going to be sitting at a default value, and you need to explicitly list it. Now the page directive is but one directive that's available here. There are other directives available for ASP.NET, and if I just was to come down and actually you could have these listed either at the very top of the page, which is going to be a best practice, and you could examine the various properties of the page directive here. But if I was just to hit the left angle bracket below page, here's the other directives that are available for you. One of the ones we'll be working with coming up is the cache, the output cache here. So whether you're using the page directive or some other ASP.NET directive, that's one way you can configure your web applications in .NET or ASP.NET. The web config file over here, and there's actually 3 by default now. We'll talk about more of that when we get to deployment. You'll notice it's very stripped down and clean here for my basic web app. I pretty much just have the system.web section, nothing else there. That's another area we can kind of configure app-wide stuff. Over in this page directive, it's just for a single web form or page. I'm going to drag and drop a button here, and notice I did not put it inside the form tag. We'll get into it in a minute after I put some controls in the form using the web config, and I can show you some configuration settings there as well. If I was to run this right now, it's immediately going to have an error. It's going to say, hey, this button must be placed inside of a form tag. So I just want to demonstrate there. You can't just arbitrarily throw your controls around on top of a web form. You need to actually set that inside of a form tag. So all your controls will live that with that run at equals server attribute, indicating that it's an ASP.NET server thing. And so this button now is there. I'll also put a text box here. I want to demonstrate something we can do in the web config. So I'm just putting a few controls on the screen that we can use for my demonstration. And again, you see these run at equals server attributes are here, indicating these are actually ASP.NET web server controls. And if I was to actually just double click the button here, it'll take me to the code behind, which will be actually write a bit of code. So we'll talk more about this in the upcoming video, but this is just the code behind file for the actual web form. And you see here that I have a simple design here, just a button and a text box. If I was to run it and I was just to hit the button, I see this hello here. I plug some text in, I see some hello. If I plug random text in, I hit the button, everything continues to work just fine. I'm going to plug in an actual script here, so something potentially malicious, like the ASP.NET button. It might be some JavaScript I plugged in here to the field, something. If I hit the button, the ASP.NET engine by default is going to say, hey, I notice this is a dangerous, potentially dangerous form value. Indicating that there's some type of a script trying to run here. That indicates what you can do if you would like to be able to do that. So if you want to turn that off, so to speak. So I'm going to come in here to the web config file, and I've pasted some text here. I've got the runtime for HTTP set to 2.0, and I've got the validate request set to false for all the pages in this particular web app. So now when I was to run this, what we would end up seeing is, without changing any code at all, we've affected the behavior of the application. It's no longer going to check for that event validation. Now, if you're going to want to do things at the page level, you'd come and do it inside of here, inside the page itself, perhaps using the page directive. If you want something to be like application-wide for all of your web forms and all of your future web forms, all your existing web forms, you would set it in the web config file. So that's one of the differences on where you might make the same setting just in a different place. If I paste that same potentially dangerous script here now, and I just click the button, it's just allowing it at this point. It's saying hello's back on the screen. So I've just overrode a default setting application-wide via my web config. Now we can use web config for other things like storing connection strings, storing data, turning on various other configuration settings, etc. So if I just, to demonstrate it, when I turn that back off in the web config and I come back in here, we're back to the defaults. So just showing you there's a few different places you configure either at the page level, at the web application level, and then of course down even at the control level, you would have some configuration settings as well. I'm going to right click and simply do a properties on my web application project. Various other configuration settings here as well about how things are going to be built, One of the areas under this web tab is the idea I told you could use an IIS web server or the default built-in Visual Studio web server. You could simply create a virtual directory right out of this page as well, so you wouldn't even have to go out to IIS to enable this. You could create an IIS website right there. There's other settings here, like which page you want to start with. And again, we're just going to stick for this series mainly using the built-in Visual Studio web server until we talk about IIS and deployment and that type of stuff. And typically that's fine. So this is just yet another area where you have some configurations options. I'm going to add a website, which again, one of the big differences between a website, and I'll do an empty one, versus a web application project is the way things get compiled. Otherwise, the web form model is going to be, and everything you talk about with the exam will be the same. But you notice if you come for a website, you don't have a project file, and you don't have a properties window that looks just like the one for a web app project. You have the slightly different property pages here, and you see the start options here. You can use the default web server, that's there as well. Another thing with websites is you get this other configuration tool, the ASP.NET configuration tool. So there are nuances or differences depending on which template I'm using, website or web application model. Most of the stuff we talk about for the whole certification exam and most of the core fundamentals around web forms are going to be the same behavior. You will have the page directive in both models. You would have the web config file in both models. You will have access to the same configuration properties, etc. Notice down here these little icons. Those are your built-in Visual Studio web servers. I'm going to go ahead and stop those at this point. In our next video, we're going to get more into the life cycle and the events and how that all happens, and we'll talk about that in the next video.